Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most glorified, misunderstood, and painfully overrated lifestyles in ancient history. The world of the Spartan warrior. You know, the guys in movies who fight with their abs, throw slow motion spears, and scream this is Sparta before kicking people into dramatic holes. Yeah, those guys. Except the real Spartans weren't models dipped in oil. They were half-starved, half-feral state property, molded from childhood into obedient tools for a regime that worshiped discipline, death, and the taste of blood pudding. Before we get into it, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy finding out that history was far worse than fiction. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Because somewhere out there, someone's probably eating a sandwich, and I'm about to ruin their appetite. Turn down the lights, take a breath, and prepare to meet your ancestors' nightmare. Not the enemy army, but the army that trained its own children like livestock. Let's be clear, you wouldn't survive a single day in ancient Sparta. Not a week, not even until lunchtime. Why? Because you're soft. That's not an insult, it's a fact. Everyone is soft compared to what Sparta demanded. Not from heroes, from 6-year-olds. Because the moment you were old enough to hold a spoon, the state handed you a knife and said, figure it out, or die. The myth of Sparta is beautiful. It smells like glory, sweat, bronze, and tragic nobility. It's sculpted in marble and narrated by movie trailers. A land of fearless warriors fighting for honor, standing united in a wall of shields, never retreating, never surrendering. That version of Sparta is clean, cinematic, convenient, but it's also fake. Sparta wasn't noble. It was a brutal militarized cult that broke boys, erased personalities, and turned the concept of childhood into a punchline. And the worst part? It worked. You wouldn't be cast as a warrior in this story. You'd be the one Spartan elders glanced at and said, too soft-bellied. Throw him off the cliff. Because yes, that happened. Not always. Not to every baby. But Sparta was perfectly willing to abandon infants it deemed unfit. Too small, too weak, too sickly, or just too much crying. They called it exposure. Nature called it infanticide. The child was left on Mount Taygetus, where nature made the final call. Harsh, sure, but this wasn't a society that saw human life as precious. It saw bodies as tools, and tools had to be sharp. Let's say you made it past that first test. Congrats. You are now property of the Spartan state. Not a citizen, not yet. Not a person, just a future warrior-shaped object. Your family might love you, but that love came second to obedience. And by the age of 7, your life as an individual was over. You were taken from your mother, stripped of comfort, stripped of softness, and dumped into the agoge, Sparta's infamous training system. And no, it wasn't a school. It was a crucible. You didn't learn how to read poetry. You learned how to steal food without getting caught. You learned how to survive beatings. You learned how to silence your screams. You wouldn't thrive there. You'd crack because you're used to warmth, to options, to someone asking how your day was. In Sparta, no one asked. No one cared. The only thing that mattered was if you obeyed, endured, and hurt others when told. Compassion was weakness. Intelligence was suspicious. And individuality was punishable. You learned through fists, hunger, and humiliation. If you wanted food, you stole it. If you were caught, you were beaten, not for stealing, but for failing. If you were slow, you were mocked. If you were emotional, you were isolated. Crying didn't bring comfort. It brought punishment. And don't imagine yourself as some lean teenager pulling heroic stunts in bronze armor. That comes later, maybe. Right now, you're just cold, barefoot, and scared, living on scraps and sleeping on straw in a room full of boys who've already learned how to break ribs quietly. Every day was a test. Every night, was a threat. And you weren't training for war. You were training for silence. So no, Sparta wasn't a land of philosophers and marble statues. It was a boot camp with temples. And the gods it worshipped weren't gods of wisdom or love. They were gods of blood, discipline, and fear. Sparta wasn't designed to inspire. It was designed to endure. Its heroes didn't write poetry. They wrote nothing. They bled, they obeyed, and they died, usually young. By now, you're probably thinking, okay, but at least they were brave. Sure, they were brave the same way a chained dog is brave when it lunges. Because fear was trained out of them. Not conquered, not processed, just erased. Sparta didn't raise heroes. It manufactured weapons. Sharp, efficient, emotionally cauterized weapons. And if you couldn't become one, you were discarded like a dull blade. You wouldn't last. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. And in ancient Sparta, humanity was the first thing to be broken. So, you're 6 years old. Maybe you've just learned how to tie a knot or pronounce the word for goat without spitting. Maybe you still cling to your mother's leg when you're scared or get excited about honey bread. None of that matters now. Because today, a state official knocks on your family's door, gives your father a silent nod, and leads you away. No ceremony, no explanation, no goodbye. Just a thin tunic and a long road to a place where you'll learn what it means to stop being a child and start being Spartan, or die trying. Welcome to the Agoge, the training system that would shape every male Spartan citizen from boy to beast. And you don't ease into it. You're thrown in like a goat into a lion pit. The first lesson, silence. The second, pain. The third, endurance. After that, it's just variations on those three until your teeth fall out or your bones give up. There are no toys, no blankets, no songs at bedtime. You sleep on a straw mat, maybe, if someone bigger hasn't stolen it. You're hungry, constantly, painfully, down to your bones hungry. But you're not fed enough. That's on purpose. Hunger teaches stealth. The instructors, adult Spartan men who themselves survived this hell, tell you you'll get stronger if you learn to take what you need. So you try to steal. And the first time you do, your hands shake. You get caught. And you're beaten. Not for the theft. Oh no, stealing is expected. You're beaten because you were bad at it. Your bruises are a lesson in efficiency. You begin to understand the rules. There's no compassion, no softness. A boy who cries is mocked, then whipped. A boy who shows kindness is isolated, punished, retrained. Every weakness is scrubbed from you like dirt from a soldier's boots. But it never feels clean, it just feels cold. The other boys don't smile much. They don't talk much either. That's by design. The Agoge teaches laconic speech, the art of saying the absolute minimum. If someone asks how you're feeling, you're supposed to grunt. If someone stabs you with a stick, you're supposed to nod. If you scream, you learn what real pain feels like next. Your instructors aren't teachers. They're guardians of pain. They walk with rods. They strike without warning. They watch everything. How you walk, how you sit, how you react to fear. One twitch in the wrong moment, and they'll break your fingers to remind you what discipline looks like. And you don't get to fight back. That's the real hell. You learn to absorb punishment with a face like stone. No tears, no whimpers, just breath held in your chest until your ribs rattle. The days are long. There's no school in the modern sense. You do train in music and dance, but not for joy. These are martial dances, war hymns, rhythm drills meant to coordinate your steps for marching and killing. Poetry? You learn to recite it in chorus, mostly so you all sound the same. Reading? Writing? Maybe a little. But words don't matter much if you're expected to bleed, not speak. You spar daily. No gloves. No armor. Just fists, sticks, and sharp elbows. And they encourage injuries. They call it hardening. If your lip splits, good. If your knuckles crack, great. If you get knocked unconscious, even better, because waking up dazed in the dirt with a boot on your chest is part of the process. You're not meant to win every fight. You're meant to keep fighting long after you've already lost. And the worst part? The competition never ends. Every boy is your rival. Friends are liabilities. Trust gets you hurt. Alliances crumble fast when there's only one crust of bread left on the communal table and two cracked mouths trying to eat it. The Agoge isn't a school. It's a gladiator ring with smaller contestants and fewer rules. There's one more lovely surprise, the mentorships. That's a polite term for older Spartans. Often you're assigned patron, developing what they claimed were educational relationships with boys. In reality, a cultural system of sanctioned pederasty, wrapped in rhetoric about guidance and spiritual development. And you didn't get to opt out. Refusing the guidance of your assigned elder was seen as weakness, even suspicion. The shame wasn't in submission. The shame was in resistance. That's the society you're trapped in, one where even exploitation wears the armor of tradition. And through it all, no matter how well you fight, steal, or suffer, you're still not a man. You're property, a maybe, a half-formed tool being hammered into shape. And that shape is simple: obedience, silence, and the ability to stab without flinching. By the time you're 12, you've watched boys vanish, sent to exile, dead from infection, or beaten into uselessness. You've learned how to dress your own wounds with dirty cloth, how to sleep with one eye open, how to win a fight by biting if necessary. You can strip a rabbit in silence, tie a perfect noose from rope weed, and lie to a grown man's face without blinking. But inside, something's dying, something human, the part of you that once wanted to sing, or touch water that wasn't cold, or be held. That part isn't needed here. That part gets left behind in the Agoge, buried under the training yard like the dreams of 1,000 other boys before you. Because Sparta doesn't want sons. It wants shadows with knives. You're 14 now, tall enough to pass for a man in any other land. Broad-shouldered, scar-mapped, and already missing teeth that won't grow back. But here in Sparta, you're not a man. You're a tool in progress, and the forge is only getting hotter. You've survived the Agoge. That's not a medal. That's a warning label. You know how to stalk, strike, and lie without blinking. You can go 4 days without food, 2 without sleep, and vanish into the hills like smoke. But the lessons aren't over. They've only changed shape. Now you live in communal barracks with your age group, called herds like animals. You still sleep on har mats. You still eat black broth, that foul, tar-thick stew of pig blood and vinegar, and call it dinner. You still fight daily, but now it's not drills. It's testing. The elders watch, rank you, grade you in bruises and knocked out breath. You're not just training anymore. You're being weighed, measured, compared, not to become an adult. That word means nothing here. You're being judged by one standard alone: usefulness to the state. And now comes the part no one speaks of, but everyone knows: the crackle. You're pulled aside one night. No torchlight, no announcements, just a nod from a superior and a blade placed in your hand. You're told to leave the city. No supplies, no bedding, no shoes. You're going into the hills, not to camp, to hunt. The prey? Helots, the enslaved class that feeds Sparta. This isn't punishment. It's not war. It's policy. The crackle is a state-sanctioned blood right. Part secret police, part initiation, part psychological demolition. You're told to spy on the helots. But if the mood strikes, if one seems too strong, too proud, too tall, you eliminate him. Quietly, without ceremony, without getting caught. If you're caught, you don't return. No one calls this murder. They call it discipline. So you spend weeks moving at night, barefoot and silent, wrapped in stolen wool and animal stink. You learn which branches crack and which don't, which dogs bark and which can be fed. You kill your first helot in silence, a man fetching water at dawn, unaware of the shadow behind him. Your hand shakes. You hesitate, but then you remember the agoge, the beatings, the lectures, the silence, and you bury the blade. When you return, you don't speak of it. No one asks, but they see it in your eyes. You've joined the ranks of Sparta's quiet ghosts, boys who've crossed that invisible line between training and utility. No applause, no title, just a slightly better cut of meat at supper, and fewer questions. From now on, your tasks get bloodier. You join border patrols, march for days through rock-cut trails and cold ravines, your breath fogging, your legs stiff, your mind blank. You carry your own food, your own waste. You sleep under trees, or not at all. When a thief is caught raiding a goat pen, you're told to make an example of him. Not with a clean blade, with wooden clubs. Slowly, you learn to hate slowly. Not with fire, but with frost. Hate that creeps in when you see a woman crying for her son and feel nothing. When your comrade breaks his ankle and the group leaves him behind. When an old man collapses in line and you don't stop walking. That's the real training. Killing mercy in yourself. You still have no personal possessions. No privacy. No softness. You're not allowed to live at home, even now. Your parents see you from time to time across the training fields. But there are no hugs. No conversations. You don't belong to them anymore. You belong to Sparta. And Sparta doesn't coddle. You've seen boys your age hang themselves from barrack beams. Others just walk into the river and don't come out. No one speaks of them. No markers are laid. No names whispered in the dark. Weakness erases memory. But you're still here, still breathing, still learning how to be invisible, invulnerable, inhuman. There are moments, brief, sharp as broken bone, when you remember what life used to feel like. A soft hand, a warm bath, a mother's voice. But they're not memories anymore. They're contaminants. You shake them off like fleas. Because if you keep them, you'll break. And Spartans don't break. At least, not where anyone can see. You're 20 now. You've made it through the gauntlet. Survived the agoge. Survived the cryptia. Survived yourself. And now, they hand you a shield. Not a gift. Not a reward. A burden. A circular slab of bronze and wood. Heavy enough to break your spine if you fall wrong. It bears the lambda, the Greek letter for Laconia, for Sparta, etched like a curse. You don't smile. You don't feel pride, because you know what this really means. You're now expected to die standing. This is the real graduation, not a ceremony. No laurel crown. No family in the crowd. Just your commander pressing the aspies into your forearm and growling, with it or on it. You've heard that line your whole life. And it's not poetry. It's a directive. Come home carrying your shield, or carried on it. You've joined the phalanx. Not just a formation, but a machine. A wall of flesh, bronze, and discipline that moves as one, breathes as one, kills as one. Your body isn't yours anymore. It's a link in the chain, a brick in the fortress. You fight shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. The man on your right guards your heart. The man on your left trusts you to guard his. Any fear, any hesitation, any twitch in the line, and the whole system collapses. So you learn to become a silence within the silence. You're trained now not to flinch when javelins fall like rain. You're drilled to step forward when you hear the command, not when your nerves allow it. You don't blink when a spear glances off your helmet. You don't duck when someone screams next to you. Because the moment you drop your shield, the moment you turn your body sideways, you expose your brother. And a Spartan would rather gut himself than break the line. The first battle comes. You've been prepared for this. You think you have. You march in formation, 70 pounds of bronze, iron, and expectation strapped to your body. Your helmet tunnels your vision. Your greaves bite into your legs. The shield bruises your forearm with every step. And then the sound. Thousands of feet pounding the earth. Shouts. Horns. The rattle of armor. You can feel the vibration in your bones long before the clash. When it comes, it's not glorious. It's not elegant. It's animal. Your line smashes into theirs like two mountain sides crashing. Shields slam. Spears jab. And in the crush, you hear everything. Breaking teeth, sucking wounds, the frantic gasp of a dying man trying to call for his mother in a language no one answers. Your first kill is blind. A jab into darkness. You feel the resistance. Then the wetness. Then the collapse. You don't see the face. You don't get a name. You're pulled forward before you can think about it. That's what combat is. Not choice, but motion. You keep moving. You thrust. You brace. You step over corpses and hope they're not yours. You hear the groans beneath you, but you don't stop. You feel something slick under your sandal. Blood or guts, you don't ask. Hours later, when the dust settles and the moans fade, you're still standing. Barely. The line held. The enemy broke. But the silence that follows isn't relief. It's accounting. You count shields. You count faces. You count which boys didn't rise again. And you keep those numbers in your head. Not out of sentiment, but because someday someone will count you. And when they do, it better be with your shield under your corpse, not beside it. You return to Sparta. No parade. No cheating crowds. The elders nod. The rest go back to eating in silence. Maybe you're given an extra olive. A slice of meat. You don't talk about the blood. You don't describe the screams. It'll be vulgar. You sit cross-legged on the cold floor, flanked by your unit, and you eat like nothing happened. Because that's what's expected. And if one of you doesn't come back, you don't speak his name. His family gets a quiet visit. The shield is returned, clean to blood. The mother doesn't cry. If she weeps, it's in private. Public grief is shameful. She stands, hands folded, and says what every Spartan woman is trained to say: he did his duty. Not he died. Not he was brave. Just he did his duty. This is your life now. Not glory. Not conquest. Maintenance. You are a cog in the endless war machine of Sparta. You patrol borders. You respond to uprisings. You kill helots if the council deems their population too bold this season. You sleep in your armor more nights than not. You wear the same cloak until it rots off your back. You are a professional warrior in a society that knows only one profession. You don't get rest days. You don't get children yet. You don't marry until 30. Even then, you can't live with your wife. Your only real relationship is with the man whose shield touches yours. And if you die, no one writes poetry. They scratch your name on a stone if you were deemed brave enough. If not, you disappear. No honor, no legacy. Just another unspoken example of what not to be. So you train harder, march farther, swing heavier, not to win, but to endure. In Sparta, survival is the only prayer, and it's whispered through broken teeth in the mud between spear thrusts. You're 30 now. Congratulations. You're finally allowed to marry. Not love, not live, just marry. Legally, that is, because for the last 15 years, your only intimate relationship has been with your spear, your shield, and the man to your left in the phalanx. You've survived your 20s without dying of infection, betrayal, exhaustion, or blunt trauma to the skull. And now Sparta rewards you with a single privilege, a wife you barely know and can't even live with. You meet her in a ceremony that feels more like a transaction than a celebration. She's young, barely past adolescence. Shorn hair, minimal words, eyes lowered. She's been trained for this. Not to be your partner, but your vessel. Her purpose is clear. Make Spartans. Nothing more. The marriage night is ritualized like everything else. You don't move into a home together. You sneak in. That's the tradition. You visit her secretly at night, like a fugitive. Because in Sparta, even your love life is subject to military discipline. You're not building a family. You're breeding soldiers. You see her rarely, a few times a month, maybe less. In between, you still live in the barracks. You still eat with your mess group. You still train, patrol, drill. You still kill when ordered. You are a public function, not a private man. Your body belongs to the city. And now, your seed does too. If a child is born, you don't celebrate yet. First, the elders must inspect him. Naked, held high in the cold air like an offering. They check the legs, the spine, the skull. If he passes, he lives. If not, he's discarded. Quietly, efficiently. There's no mourning. Weakness is not a tragedy. It's a defect. You feel something crack inside you just a little. You hide it because you've learned not to feel too much. Not here. Not in this city built on silence and bones. You bury emotion the same way you bury the dead, with dirt and duty. You tell yourself that pain is weakness, that grief is indulgence, that thinking about what could have been is a luxury only other people have. You keep training. You now supervise younger soldiers. You bar commands at boys who were in diapers when you were crushing skulls at the border. Some listen, some don't. You remember being them. You remember that terrifying combination of rage, confusion, and desperate need for approval. You hate them for it. You envy them for it. You correct them with a slap, a fist, a bruise, because you know one day they'll be the only thing standing between Sparta and whatever army dares look south. You drill them harder than you were drilled, because that's how the cycle continues. You walk the city at night, inspecting hell at quarters, listening for whispers of rebellion. You don't need a reason to punish. Suspicion is enough. Too much grain harvested? Suspicious. Too little? Also suspicious. You're not here to make sense. You're here to keep the machine oiled with fear and obedience. You start to lose track of seasons. The years blur into campaigns. Summer marches. Winter garrisons. You don't count birthdays anymore. Only names of men who didn't come back. Your knee hurts when it rains. Your knuckles ache. Your back protests every morning. You wear the same red cloak, but it hangs differently now. The boy underneath is long gone, but no one notices or cares. You're expected to endure until you can't. Some nights, when you lie alone in your corner of the barracks, you hear the soft cry of someone else's nightmare. One of the younger men, reliving his first kill. You don't comfort him. You don't even acknowledge it. You just stare into the dark and count your breaths until dawn. You wonder if anyone will remember your name. You wonder if that matters. Because in Sparta, no statue bears the name of a soldier unless he died in the front line. No history is written in your honor unless your bones are scattered across enemy soil. Survival is not glory. It's maintenance. You're not a hero. You are a tool. And tools are meant to be used until they break. You are 60 years old. That makes you ancient by Spartan standards. A relic. A survivor. A mistake. Your beard is gray now. Your teeth few. Your joints swollen with the memories of every campaign. You walk slower. You sit longer. You groan when you stand. And no one dares mock you. Not out of respect, but because you carry the authority of someone who outlived better men. Men who died before they had time to fail. Men who died glorious, beautiful, useful. You just kept breathing. You no longer fight. Not with spears, at least. You fight with words now. With glances. With memories sharp enough to draw blood. You serve as an elder. A judge. You sit at the Syssitia with the other survivors. A half circle of broken backs and blind eyes. You chew slowly. Speak rarely. Every phrase is a hammer. Every silence, a lesson. The younger warriors look at you with a mix of reverence and horror. To them, you're what waits at the end of the road. A bent frame in a red cloak, muttering about formations and fallen friends, still correcting their posture with a stick. You're a walking cautionary tale. You spend your days supervising training, measuring grain, adjudicating disputes, mostly between helots. Occasionally between two ambitious young warriors desperate to earn a place in the next campaign. You hear them arguing, posturing, speaking of honor and courage. You don't laugh, but you want to. They think war is still about glory, about proving themselves, about legacy. You know better. You've watched boys beg for their mothers with a lungful of blood. You've seen a man step forward in the phalanx and be erased by a javelin before he even drew breath. You've seen captains weep over puddles of brains. And you've buried men whose names no one bothered to remember. So no, you don't tell stories. You sit and you weigh, because now your job is judgment. You decide which boys become men, which helots need punishment, which warriors deserve promotion. You evaluate not just skill, but control. That's sacred Spartan virtue. Not ferocity, not speed, discipline. A man who hesitates is dangerous, but a man who enjoys the kill, that's worse. And sometimes, though you never admit it aloud, you see in their eyes the same thing you saw in yourself. The boy from 40 years ago, thin, angry, proud, try not to tremble. It hurts, but not as much as pretending it doesn't. You go home rarely. Your wife, now wrinkled, distant, still keeps the house in perfect Spartan order. She doesn't smile. You don't touch. You share bread in silence. Your children are grown. Your sons serve now. Somewhere. You don't ask where. Not because you don't care, but because if they die, you want to find out the proper way by the knock on the door, the shield left leaning by the threshold. You keep your armor in a chest at the foot of the bed. Still oiled, still clean, but untouched for years. You tell yourself you could still wear it if needed, that your muscles remember, that if Sparta called, you'd rise. But you know that's a lie. You couldn't lift the shield for more than a minute. Your spear arm shakes when you hold your cup. The thought of marching 5 leagues makes your knees ache in protest. So instead, you remember. You remember the first time you killed. The weight of a man dying on your spear. How his eyes didn't look afraid, just surprised. You remember the blood in your teeth from biting leather to stay awake during the winter watch. You remember the stink of unwashed cloaks and the groans of the wounded trying not to scream. You remember the boys you buried, the brothers you outlived. You remember too much. And in Sparta, remembering is dangerous. Because this city doesn't run on memory. It runs on repetition, on ritual, on forgetting. It needs young men to believe that they'll live forever. That death is clean. That glory is real. So your grief must stay quiet. Your regrets must wear armor. And your nightmares? Those are yours alone. Some nights, you dream of helots, of their faces, of the ones you killed because a magistrate handed you a list and said, "Take care of it." You told yourself it was justice, that they were planning rebellion, that every drop of their blood kept Sparta strong. But now, with 60 winters on your shoulders, you can't help but wonder how many of those men were just breathing wrong, and how many had children. You light a candle, just one, not for them. That would be treason, but for the part of yourself that didn't come back. The next morning, you wake before dawn. You still do, out of habit. Your old bones hate the cold, but your mind still needs the discipline. You dress slowly. You visit the gymnasium. You don't lift weights. You supervise. You correct a stance here, a lunge there. The boys nod. They respect you, but they don't really know you. They know the idea of you, the elder, the survivor, the man who never fell. And you let them believe it, because they need to, because that's what keeps the wall standing, this myth, this idea, this weight that Sparta puts on every back it owns. You look at your hands, twisted, scarred, shaking slightly. You smile barely. You're still here. And that, in itself, is the most un-Spartan thing you've ever done. You leave before dawn, when the city is still wrapped in the cold breath of sleep, and even the dogs are too tired to bark. You don't announce your departure. You don't write a farewell. Spartans don't leave notes. Spartans don't explain. You simply put on your cloak, the old one, faded from sun and blood and years, and step outside. No armor, no shield, just a dagger in your belt and the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knows this path has only one direction. The streets are empty, paved with dust and silence. You pass the training yard where boys shout themselves hoarse in the name of discipline. You pass the barracks where warriors sleep curled like hounds beside their spears. You pass the statues of Leonidas and the dead who followed him, the stone faces frozen in defiance. You nod once, not in reverence, not in mourning, just recognition. You've outlived your time. That's enough. The road out of Sparta winds through the hills, climbing toward the mountains where the goats roam and the rocks whisper with wind. It's steep, cruel to old knees, but you don't stop. Not even when your breath hitches. Not when your joints pop like snapped twigs. You walk like you're being chased, not by men, but by memory. You carry them all with you. The boy who never came home from Thermopylae, the helot who begged before the knife went in, the son you never saw again after his last campaign. Their faces press against your ribs like ghosts with elbows. By midday, you reach the high paths, where the air thins and the trees grow twisted and mean. There's a cave here, small, black as the inside of a helmet, hidden behind a tumble of stone. You knew it from youth, from days when you and your brothers trained by wrestling in goat dung and bruises. Back then, it was a place to sneak off and test courage. Now it's a place to vanish. You duck inside. The air is damp, stale. You light a stub of tallow wrapped in linen. The flickering flame makes the shadows breathe. You sit, not because you're tired, though you are, but because your body no longer accepts standing for long without complaint. You lean back against the wall, feel the cold reach through your spine like a warning. You smile. It's been years since you felt something that wasn't pain. You didn't come here to die. Not exactly. You came to disappear. There's a difference. Spartans are not buried with ceremony unless they fall in battle or childbirth. You've done neither. You're not honored. You're not remembered. If you stayed in the city, you'd become a cautionary tale. The one who lived too long. The one who cried at night. The one who questioned orders. You've seen what they do to old warriors who stop playing the part. You try to serve as an elder. You try to play the role of wise survivor. But your hands tremble when you hold a cup. You flinch at loud noises. You forget names, but never the screams. And worst of all, you've started to speak honestly. That makes you dangerous. So now, alone, with only the wind and the mountain goats for witnesses, you let yourself remember everything. You remember the child you were, stripped, beaten, sharpened like a blade against stone. You remember the agoge, the days without food, the nights without warmth, the endless drills under a sky that never once offered comfort. You remember your first kill, how your spear got stuck in his ribs and you had to kick him off while he coughed blood into your sandals. You remember the girls who weren't allowed names, only roles. The boys who died for nothing. The friends who didn't grow old enough to hate the city that shaped them. And you remember the pride. The spine-straightening pride that made it all feel worth it. You held on to it like a shield, even after the blade broke. Until one day, you woke up and realized it wasn't pride anymore, just stubbornness in a cloak. You lie back. The stone is wet against your shoulder blades. The ceiling of the cave hangs low, like a mouth that's forgotten how to chew. You take out the dagger. It's old, not ceremonial, not beautiful. Just iron and wood. You turn it over in your hand, not yet ready, not yet sure. Not because you're afraid to die, but because you're not entirely sure you deserve to. The candle burns lower. The shadows crawl closer. Outside, the wind howls. A memory, or maybe a voice. You don't move, because this is what it means to be a Spartan and survive. Not victory, not glory, just this. A body full of splinters. A cave full of silence. A man full of questions. You do not pray. The gods stopped listening a long time ago. Maybe they never listened at all. But you do whisper a name, not your own. Back in Sparta, no one mentioned your name. No proclamations are issued. No funerary rites performed. No boys are told your story. You're not a martyr. You're not a traitor. You're not even a whisper in the barracks. You are officially unaccounted for. And in Sparta, unaccounted for means irrelevant. The city runs on a kind of collective blindness. If it doesn't bleed, doesn't shout, doesn't die with glory, then it isn't real. The boys at the Agoge don't notice your absence. Why would they? Their days are filled with drills, bruises, punishments doled out for blinking wrong or speaking out of turn. They don't learn names. They learn obedience. Their instructors bark lessons over the sound of cracked bones and broken voices. Pain is a teacher. Fear is a choice. Survival is earned. Phrases carved into them like wounds that won't clot. They don't know that one of their elders, the man who once stood silent at the edge of the training ground, is gone. But someone notices. A woman. A mother of none and of all. She remembers your hands, the way they shook slightly when you passed the barley bowl at the communal table. She remembers your back, how it arched too slowly when you rose to speak. She remembers your voice, not loud but certain, too certain for comfort. She says nothing, of course. She too was taught silence, but she scrapes a mark on the post outside her hut. A notch in the wood, that means. Another has vanished. There are many such notches. Some are hers, some aren't. The city keeps breathing. The elders convene, talk of discipline and war and harvest. The ephors chant about vigilance and loyalty. They speak of Persia, of Athens, of Macedon. Always someone to fight, always someone to hate. The names change, the fear doesn't. Behind every decree, every training schedule, every flaying of a boy who dared weep, lies a deeper truth no one says aloud. Sparta is afraid of peace. War gives them purpose. Blood gives them structure. Glory gives them permission. But peace leaves room for questions. And questions are dangerous. So they tighten the rituals. The feasts become harsher. The dances more rigid. The boys younger. The punishments quicker. The songs louder, not to celebrate, but to drown the doubt. In the square, statues are scrubbed clean daily, even as the streets fill with the stink of the forgotten. Nothing tarnishes bronze. Everything tarnishes flesh. One boy does ask, though. He's 10, maybe 11. His eyes are too bright, too curious. He asks, what happens when a warrior gets old? The instructor hits him hard enough to split his lip and says, a Spartan never gets old. He dies first. The boy nods. He never asks again. But that night, he dreams of mountains, of wind, of silence. Down by the Eurotas River, a Helot girl finds a broken sandal. It's too large, the leather worn, the strap frayed. She shows it to her brother and whispers, a warrior left it. He tells her to drop it, burn it, forget it. They do. But before the fire takes it, the girl stares at the sandal like it's a question she can't name. She grows up fast like all Helots do. And one day, when she's older and braver, she'll leave the city too. But not for death, for more. Up in the hills, where the air turns thin and the rocks remember, the cave still holds your scent. Animals come and go. Bones bleach slowly under the half-light. Moss creeps up the walls. No one climbs up to check. No one lights a fire for your soul. In Sparta, grief is a weakness. Mourning is reserved for those who fall in front of witnesses. And you had none. Still, the city knows. Not in words, not in records, but in the subtle way men flinch when the wind howls, and how the oldest soldiers drink faster when sitting alone, and how the Effers look away when a boy stares too long at the mountains. The city knows, and it forgets, on purpose. A new campaign is planned. Young men sharpen spears. Mothers prepare mourning cloth just in case. The blacksmith hammers iron like it's a hymn. The river runs red from dying cloaks. And once more, Sparta marches. Faces painted, shields raised, voices hoarse from shouting the names of dead kings. They pass the cave. They don't look up. No one carves your name into stone. There is no cenotaph in the agora, no whisper in the barracks, no old comrade who raises a cup in your memory. You don't exist on any scroll in any list of fallen. The last time someone said your name aloud, it was probably you in that cave when your voice cracked from thirst and regret and something older than both. The silence that followed wasn't an answer. It was a verdict. The cave knows. The stone floor still holds your shape. The dagger, dulled by time and blood, lies beside your hand, half buried in dust. Animals sniffed you once, but left you be. Even scavengers show respect to certain kinds of stillness. Your bones rest in their final posture, not collapsed in surrender, but curled in contemplation, as if waiting for someone to say you mattered. But no one comes. And so the wind becomes your mourner, the moss your pallbearer. Seasons pass. The cave mouth narrows with fallen leaves and time. Lichen grows over the cracks in your skull. You become part of the hill. And then, less than that. Just wait. Just shape. Just story waiting to be found. Far below, Sparta moves on. Or at least pretends to. New boys are born. New enemies declared. A new generation of Spartans learns to kill before they learn to speak of mercy. But something is different now. Barely. Like a hairline fracture beneath polished marble. A hesitation in the voice of an instructor. A tremor in the knee of a returning soldier. A rumor, because someone did remember. A boy, now almost a man, once saw you limp back from battle with a face like ash and hands like stone. He remembers how you stood still too long during the anthem. How you gripped the wine cup as if afraid to drop it. How you stared at the sky like it owed you something. He didn't know your name. Still doesn't. But he remembers. And that memory, thin as a spider's thread, refuses to snap. One night, when the moon is sharp enough to cut, he sneaks out, climbs the same trail, follows no map, just instinct and something older. The whisper of a question that no Spartan is allowed to ask. He finds a cave. He doesn't cry. He doesn't speak. He doesn't enter. But he leaves a single black feather on the stone outside and walks back down before the sun can see him. Years later, the boy will become a man. He'll survive wars. He'll kill. He'll be honored. And one day, when his knees ache and his breath shortens, he too will vanish into the hills. Not for glory, not for punishment, but because now he knows. You weren't a shame. You were a mirror, and Sparta doesn't bury mirrors. It breaks them. She was born into war and fed on myth. The girl they would one day call Mother of the Monster entered the world in the shadow of a battlefield and the echo of empire. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, and Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Augustus himself, was not born to live a quiet life. She was born a Roman, more precisely, a Julian, and that meant her blood came pre-stained with the ink of history and the stench of ambition. Her father was Rome's golden boy, a general worshipped by the legions and adored by the people. Germanicus was the kind of man whose name poets used like perfume, noble, tragic, beloved. When he died under mysterious circumstances in Syria, perhaps poisoned, perhaps simply unlucky, the city of Rome did not mourn quietly. It tore its clothes, smashed its statues, and whispered a betrayal. Agrippina's mother raged against the Emperor Tiberius, screaming treason into the silence of a court that already wanted her gone. She marched back to Rome with her children in tow, a living accusation draped in black. And so little Agrippina was taught early, trust no man, not even emperors, especially not emperors. Her childhood was not childhood at all. It was a parade of funerals and accusations, exile and return. Her mother was exiled. Her brothers were imprisoned, starved, quietly erased. One by one, the lights of her family flickered out, and still she remained. Watching, learning, remembering. At 13, she was married off like a commodity to a man she did not choose. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a cousin and a brute. He was vulgar, cruel, and proud of it. Everything about him, said the historians, was detestable. But he had an aim, and so did she, and together they produced something the world would regret. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a boy who would become Nero, a boy whose lullabies were whispers of murder and lullabies of empire. Agrippina survived her first marriage the way women like her always did, by wearing masks. In public, she smiled. In private, she waited. Her husband died. Eventually, some say of dropsy, others of divine punishment. She did not grieve. She packed her son, her ambitions, and her bitterness, and stepped back into Rome with the posture of a woman who knew that survival was not enough. Victory was required, but Rome was not ready for her. Not yet. Tiberius still ruled, gray and monstrous, rotting slowly in his villa on Capri, while Sejanus, his Praetorian puppet master, made and unmade fates from the shadows. Agrippina kept her head down. She learned from her mother's mistakes. She bided her time, and then the pendulum swung. Tiberius died. Caligula rose. Her brother, her blood, the boy she had known in childhood, now wearing the laurels of a living god. At first she rejoiced. At last, a Julian on the throne. At last, safety. But Caligula was no savior. He was the mirror turned inside out. Where others saw madness, Agrippina saw pattern. He ruled by fear because fear worked. He humiliated senators, slept with his sisters, declared war on the sea, and made his horse a consul. Rome laughed until it screamed. She was no fool. She played her part, smiled at feasts, appeared in parades, accepted honors with lowered eyes. But Caligula's paranoia was a cancer that could not be treated. He turned on everyone, including her. She and her sister Livilla were accused of conspiracy, plotted, perhaps, by men who wanted them out of the way or by the emperor himself, eager to remind even his kin who held the reins. Agrippina was exiled to the Pontine Islands, stripped of titles, humiliated, forgotten, but she waited. When Caligula was assassinated, stabbed to death in a corridor by his own guards, his body desecrated and left to rot, it was not his sisters who mourned. Agrippina returned, cloaked in silence and dignity, with a sun in her hand and a storm in her eyes. She had survived Tiberius, outlived Caligula, buried a husband, born an heir, and Rome, as always, had a vacancy, a throne with no queen, a boy with no father, an emperor named Claudius, and Agrippina, with her dead mother's rage and her father's ghost whispering in her ear, was not done. Not even close. When a mob tore Caligula to pieces, they didn't just murder an emperor, they decapitated a myth. The divine son of Germanicus, the living god with a horse consul and incest in his heart, fell screaming under the blades of his own guard. Rome didn't mourn. Rome exhaled like a city waking from fever. And into that breathless silence slithered the one man no one had expected to survive the massacre, Claudius. The forgotten uncle, the stammering fool, the historian hidden behind curtains while his family poisoned and strangled itself into extinction. When the Praetorians found him cowering behind a drapery, they didn't see a man, they saw a vessel, someone they could shape, manipulate, use. And so Claudius, gnarled and awkward, wearing the twitch of a man who's waited his whole life to be ignored, became emperor. Not by lineage, not by claim, but by accident. And that was precisely the opening Agrippina needed. She did not rush back to court. She did not wear her grief in garlands. She returned slowly, dressed in mourning, veiled like a statue of vengeance, with her young son Lucius, barely 10, marching beside her like an offering. Caligula had been her brother, yes, but his death was not her tragedy. It was her opportunity. Her first husband, Domitius Ahenobarbus, had long since died and left her little but a questionable legacy and a son with too much ambition in his eyes. Her own reputation had been tainted by exile and whispers, her bloodline worn thin by survival. But Rome loved a phoenix, and Agrippina, if nothing else, knew how to rise. The palace had changed. Messalina ruled now, young, lascivious, hungry. Claudius's third wife, still warm from her last affair, had filled the imperial court with her lovers, her sycophants, her plans. She bore him children, most notably Britannicus, and wrapped herself around the throne like ivy, decorative, strangling. Agrippina watched and waited. She did not challenge Messalina directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, she built networks. She wrote letters. She spoke to freedmen, to senators, to governors' wives at the baths. She reminded Rome, subtly, softly, that she was the daughter of Germanicus, the granddaughter of Agrippa, the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself. She wrapped her son in that heritage like armor. Then Messalina, in an act of either madness or arrogance, married another man while Claudius was away, in full ceremony, with guests. She did not even attempt to hide it. Perhaps she thought the emperor too feeble to object. Perhaps she believed she had already replaced him in everything but name. But Claudius returned, and the hammer fell. The guards dragged her out and executed her in the gardens, without trial, without a word. One moment, empress. The next, meet. Her blood soaked the pebbles where she had once walked in silks. The imperial bed was empty again, and Agrippina, cloaked in virtue, filled it. There were other options, of course, widows of noblemen, virgins with good reputations, daughters of governors from old patrician families. But none had what she had, the Julian name and a living male heir. Rome still worshipped Augustus. To marry his bloodline was to sanctify the dynasty. Agrippina offered more than beauty or comfort. She offered legacy, a solution, and she played her role perfectly. Modest in public, deferential to the Senate, devoted to the memory of her brother and the unity of Rome. There was one obstacle, the law. A man could not marry his niece, not even an emperor. But laws were parchment. Claudius bent them with a signature. The Senate passed a special decree permitting the union, and in 49 AD, the wedding took place. Rome whispered, gasped, pretended to be scandalized. But the match stood. Agrippina was now the empress. She did not waste time with celebrations. Immediately, she began the work of reconstruction, not of buildings, but of power. She removed Messalina's allies one by one, slowly, with precision. Some were reassigned, some exiled, a few simply vanished. In their place, she installed her own network, trusted freedmen, loyal secretaries, ambitious young senators grateful for her patronage. The palace changed temperature. No more orgies in the corridors. No more pillow talk conspiracies. Now, silence reigned. Discipline, eyes behind every curtain. Claudius, ever the academic, praised her efficiency. He thought he had found a wife who would mother his children and soothe his nerves. What he had found was a tactician in pearls. And most dangerous part, she made him feel safe. She flattered his intellect, listened to his stories of Carthaginian agriculture, praised his policies. And while he dozed off reading his own histories, she rewrote the future. The key was Nero, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, son of a disgraced consul and a mother who once lived in exile. He was no threat to anyone until Claudius adopted him. Agrippina orchestrated it all. Public ceremonies, formal declarations, coins struck with a new name. Nero. The name echoed with strength, legacy, fire. A myth reborn. He was now, officially, heir to the empire. Britannicus, Messalina's son, was younger, sidelined, treated like a junior actor waiting for a role that would never come. Agrippina did not harm him. Not yet. But she clipped his wings in every direction. His tutors were replaced. His allies marginalized. His appearances limited. Rome learned to forget him. The court learned to fear her. Agrippina appeared beside Claudius at every ceremony, her son just behind. She wore the imperial purple, sat on the tribunal, reviewed soldiers, issued decrees. Her face appeared on coins, unprecedented. Empresses were not rulers in Rome. They were ornaments. But Agrippina made herself indispensable. She was not beside the emperor. She was above him, beneath him, inside the very workings of the state. He spoke. She decided. He ruled. She governed. And Rome adjusted. Because Rome always adjusts. In the public eye, she remained the perfect matron. Pious, reserved, a mother before all else. But in the shadows, she maneuvered like a general. She played one faction against another, used Claudius's freedmen like chess pieces, and began building a Rome not of stone, but of loyalty. Every decision, every appointment, every marriage contract flowed through her. And those who questioned her found themselves corrected, gently at first, then permanently. Claudius aged. He grew slower. He began confusing names, repeating stories. He smiled too often at his stepson. He let his guard down, and Agrippina smiled back. Always smiling, always present. A wife, a mother, a shadow. He did not see the danger. He never had. But one day he would sit down to eat, raise a goblet of wine sweetened for his palate, and taste not comfort, but silence. Because Agrippina was not interested in power shared. She had built a future. Now it needed room to grow. And the old emperor, like a cracked statue of a dead god, would simply have to be removed. Claudius had once been a historian of his own humiliation. He wrote of kings and tyrants, cataloged their triumphs and assassinations, listed their follies like dead butterflies pinned in rows. He had watched Rome bleed under Tiberius, boil under Caligula, and had survived not because he was strong, but because he was forgettable, a stutter, a limp, a man people spoke over and never about. His very uselessness had saved him until it became his crown. And now, years into his reluctant reign, he sat surrounded by marble, gods, and flattery, and did not see the noose tightening. He believed in governance by scholarship. He wrote edicts no one read and reformed tax laws that no one followed. He drank too much, trusted too easily, and aged too slowly for his own good. What he did not know, or refused to see, was that the empire no longer belonged to him. It lived now in the glint of Agrippina's eye, in the soft tread of Nero's sandals, in the silken corridors where servants bowed lower for her than for him. He still signed the decrees, yes, but they were her words, her plans, her empire scribbled in his name. Agrippina was patient. She understood, timing the way a general understands terrain. She didn't rush. She fortified. Nero, now a young man of nearly 17, had been groomed with obsessive care. His education was overseen by Seneca, whose wisdom had been purchased with exile and restored by necessity. His loyalty, however, belonged not to Claudius, but to the woman who had built his entire future brick by brick, face by face, corpse by corpse. Agrippina did not raise a son. She sculpted a weapon, and she was ready to use it. Claudius, perhaps sensing the faint chill of displacement, began to speak more frequently of Britannicus, his natural son, Messalina's boy, now a quiet adolescent with pale skin and wary eyes. He mentioned him at banquets. He praised his Latin. He laughed too long at his jokes, and Agrippina saw immediately for what it was: hesitation, a trembling at the edge of betrayal. She had made Claudius emperor's father again, but if he wavered, if he dared to reconsider succession, dared to restore the line of Messalina, then everything she had built could be undone in a whisper. So she made a decision. It would not be blood in the Forum, no daggers in the Senate. That had been Caligula's way: brutal, loud, messy. Agrippina preferred Rome to wake slowly, to open its eyes to a fait accompli. The emperor would die a natural death. Painless, if he were lucky. Clean. He adored mushrooms. It was an old joke in the palace that the emperor would rather lose a province than skip a dish of fungi. He claimed they cleared his mind. Agrippina made sure they would do the opposite. On the night of the banquet, the palace glittered. Torches burned low. Musicians strummed lazily in the background. Claudius drank heavily, ate more. And when the dish was brought, roasted mushrooms with oil and herbs, he smiled like a child. He ate, licked his fingers, reached for more, and then stopped. It began with a cough, a wheeze, then silence. He slumped forward. His eyes rolled. Servants screamed. Agrippina remained seated. There are many versions of what happened next. Some say she summoned Xenophon, Claudius's physician, and he inserted a feather down the emperor's throat, not to purge him, but to coat the swelling tongue with more poison. Others say he was recovering until she ordered a second dose in his gruel. No one knows for certain. The poison worked as poison always does, with deniability. Claudius died that night, or perhaps the next morning. The exact hour was blurred deliberately. Agrippina delayed the announcement. She kept the doors closed. She had a succession to stage. Nero needed to be ready. The Praetorians needed to be reminded. The Senate needed to be summoned, and Britannicus, poor forgotten Britannicus, needed to be silenced. Agrippina orchestrated every movement like a conductor with a symphony of lies. When the death was finally proclaimed, Rome was already dressed for a new dawn. Nero appeared at dawn, robed in purple, flanked by guards, weeping tastefully for a father he never loved. Claudius was declared god. Statues were erected, coins minted. He was buried with honors in the mausoleum of Augustus. His death was made holy by the sheer weight of ceremony. But behind the veil of incense, everyone knew. The widow had struck again. Agrippina stood beside Nero at the funeral, her face a mask of maternal grief, her hand clasping his as though in comfort. But the fingers that held him were not soft. They were iron. She had not merely outlived her husband. She had rewritten the meaning of imperial widowhood. She was not the relic of a dead emperor. She was the architect of a new one. And Nero, crowned by her will, kissed her hand in public. But somewhere behind that gesture, in the spaces between obedience and resentment, something shifted. He was emperor now, and emperors do not kneel forever. But for now, he obeyed. He called her Augusta. He bowed to her judgment. He performed his role with youthful vigor, promising reform, harmony, a golden age. And Rome, weary of uncertainty, welcomed him like spring after famine. Agrippina watched it all, standing at the summit of her power, cloaked in laurels and veils. She had married in a madness, buried 2 emperors, and birthed a 3rd. No Roman woman had ever risen so high. She had achieved the impossible. Now, she just had to keep it. In the beginning, Nero was not yet Nero. He was the promise of Nero, the outline, the marble block before the sculptor's blade. Rome saw in him not the tyrant of future nightmares, but a new Augustus. Young, handsome, poetic, blessed by lineage and bathed in the perfume of dynastic continuity. The death of Claudius had left a void, yes, but the arrival of Nero, graceful, golden, 17 years old, felt like redemption. He was a fresh page, and Agrippina held the pen. The Senate hailed him as princeps with ceremonial enthusiasm. The Praetorian Guard swore their loyalty with sharpened sincerity, and the people, still reeling from the morbid farce of Caligula and the dusty pedantry of Claudius, clapped as if history were a play that had finally recast its lead. But all eyes, in truth, looked not to the boy on the throne, but to the woman standing just behind him. Agrippina did not hide. Why should she? She had no precedent to fear, no matronly archetype to fit into. She was not Livia, whispering discreetly behind veils. She was not Octavia, sainted in silence. She was Agrippina, daughter of Germanicus, great-granddaughter of Augustus, widow of one emperor, mother of another. If Rome could have a divine father, why not a divine mother? If Jupiter reigned from Olympus, why couldn't Juno hold court on the Palatine? She ordered coins struck with both their faces, hers and Nero's, facing outward, equal in size, as if to announce that the empire had 2 heads, 2 minds, 2 hearts. No empress before her had dared this. The Senate grumbled. Historians raised quills in alarm, but no one moved against her. How could they? The guard obeyed her. The ministers owed their appointments to her. Even Seneca, tutor of emperors, composed letters that passed first through her hands. She oversaw petitions. She read foreign dispatches. Ambassadors sought her audience before Nero's. She was seen at judicial hearings, seated beside the throne. She wore imperial purple. She issued orders. She signed documents. She dined at the same table as generals. All of it unprecedented. All of it deliberate. Agrippina was not content with proximity to power. She practiced sovereignty in everything but name, and Nero allowed it. At first, he had been raised to obey her, shaped by her will, taught to see the empire not as his by right, but theirs by design. She had chosen his tutors, censored his books, selected his guards, and arranged every bow of every senator who knelt before him. In private, he still called her mother, but in public she became Augusta, and in the corners of his mind, she became something else entirely, an eclipsing star, brilliant but suffocating. The court became a theater of dual sovereignty. Ministers deferred to her before approaching him. Courtiers watched her expressions to predict imperial mood. At ceremonies, when Nero rose to speak, her presence at his side often drew more attention than his words. In public processions, she rode in a separate chariot, not behind, but beside his. She was not Rome's dowager. She was Rome's co-ruler. Even his smallest gestures bore weight. A nod from Agrippina could make or ruin a career. A cold glance at a senator could shatter alliances forged over years. Her silences were strategic, her words barbed with velvet. Those who remembered Messalina's downfall, how quickly Rome devoured a woman it once celebrated, watched her with her wrapped in terror. They whispered that she was too bold, too visible, too proud, that she dared too much, but they whispered it quietly. Meanwhile, Nero, the boy who had once trembled at her fury, began to test the boundaries of his new godhood. He discovered music, poetry, perfume, pleasure. He dined late, drank deeper, disappeared into villas with actors, dancers, musicians, people who never spoke of politics or lineage or expectation. People who did not remind him of the blood on which his throne had been built. And still, Agrippina endured. She did not object to his indulgences, not at first. She believed him malleable, believed that freedom was a phase, believed that as long as the empire's gears turned to her rhythm, the boy could sing, weep, and fornicate to his heart's content. After all, had she not already buried one emperor and raised another? What was a little theatrical rebellion compared to true control? But rebellion, like poison, often begins unnoticed. Nero stopped inviting her to private councils. He requested that envoys meet him alone. He began signing edicts without her review. Minor changes, yes, but changes. He flirted with independence like a drunk with the edge of a balcony. And then, without warning, he appointed a new mistress of the treasury without consulting her. A small betrayal, but she saw it for what it was, the first chisel strike against her marble dominion. She summoned him. The meeting was private. The words were not recorded. But history agrees. It was a confrontation of titans. She reminded him of who she was, of what she had sacrificed. She pointed to the bloodline on which he sat like a borrowed cloak. She invoked the ghosts of Caligula and Claudius. She reminded him, too clearly, that his empire had been bought with her cunning and paid for with her risk. And he, still only 18, still raw with adolescent pride and imperial delusion, did something that would change the fate of the Julio-Claudian line forever. He walked out. Agrippina was left alone in her villa, surrounded by statues of gods and husbands she had outlived, staring at the open door through which her son, the emperor she had created, had vanished, not as a child in need of comfort, but as a ruler escaping her orbit. That night, she did not sleep. She knew the signs. She had read enough imperial histories to recognize the script when it began to turn against its author. And yet, she did not panic. She sent no assassins. She wrote no letters. She waited, because Agrippina had not spent a lifetime outwitting monsters to be undone by a boy with a lyre. Not yet. At first, it was silence. Not the kind of silence that soothes or heals, but the thick, suffocating quiet that creeps into palaces before the fall of dynasties. Agrippina felt it immediately. The doors of power no longer opened at her touch. Her name, once spoken with reverence in every senatorial corridor, now provoked hesitation, discomfort, glances exchanged over goblets. She was still Augusta, yes, but the title had become ornamental, ceremonial, ornamental like a funeral mass carved too early. Nero had begun to rule alone, not with competence, not with clarity, but with enthusiasm. He replaced ministers she had appointed with flatterers who spoke of music and moonlight. He withdrew from the council chamber and entered the stage. Rome, accustomed to emperors who governed like gods or generals, now had a boy who fancied himself Orpheus, strumming verses about desire while the empire's borders smoldered. Seneca tried to mediate. Burrus, ever the cautious tactician, urged patience. He is young, they said. Give him time. But Agrippina knew better. Time is the one luxury denied to women who have ruled, even from behind the curtain. The longer she waited, the more invisible she would become. And invisibility, in Rome, was the final step before erasure. So she acted, subtly at first. She began appearing in public again, not beside Nero, but with old allies. She attended gladiatorial games, funded public banquets, offered donations to temples in her name alone. She did not challenge his authority, not openly, but she reminded Rome that there was an alternative center of gravity, a second sun in the imperial sky. She visited the legions, invoked the name of her father, Germanicus, and let senators know that she still remembered every favor owed to her and every slight. Nero noticed. Of course he did. His new advisors whispered poison into his ears. That Agrippina plotted, that she undermined, that she longed to replace him. He began to watch her movements, limit her audience, restrict her finances. He reassigned her guards. He had statues of her removed from public buildings. On one occasion, he interrupted a speech she was giving at a dedication ceremony, sending an official to escort the Empress Mother back to her residence. In front of thousands, Agrippina did not flinch. She bowed. She left. And the next day, she sent gold to every member of that crowd. But the mask was cracking. She saw it in the courtiers who once kissed her hem and now looked away. She saw it in Seneca, who avoided her gaze. She saw it in Nero's new mistress, Act, who, despite her low birth, had been given a private villa and an escort of guards, luxuries that once belonged only to empresses. And then came the unspoken threat, an invitation to dinner, not in Rome, but at Baiae, a luxurious villa by the sea, built on warm baths and cold secrets. Nero was charming, effusive, affectionate. He toasted her health. He sang for her. He recalled childhood memories. Agrippina, too wise to be lulled, smiled as if she believed him. And then, after the feast, she was offered a ship. A gift, Nero said, to speed her journey home. She boarded. She thanked him. She embraced the crew. And once the vessel was far enough from shore, the plan was set into motion. The ceiling collapsed. A pre-designed mechanism, a sabotage canopy, was meant to crush her instantly. But fate, or perhaps sheer Roman spite, saved her. A servant beside her was killed, crushed like a melon under marble, but Agrippina, bruised, bloodied, crawled from beneath the beams. The sailors panicked. Plan B, scuttle the ship. She was thrown overboard. Darkness. Cold. The taste of iron in her mouth. And yet, even here, Agrippina refused to die politely. She swam, one arm broken, her gown dragging her down like a shroud. She kicked, bit through seawater, clawed toward the shore with the rage of a mother betrayed. By morning, she had been pulled from the sea by fishermen, half dead, half divine. When she returned to her villa, she did not scream. She did not weep. She sent a letter to Nero. It said, simply, Mother has survived. No threats, no quiescence, no pleas, just fact. And that, more than any curse, terrified him, because Nero now understood something fatal. Poison failed. Sabotage failed. The sea refused her. Agrippina was not a woman. She was a revenant, a curse in silk, a goddess of vengeance with salt in her hair and blood under her fingernails. And so he decided, no more elegance, no more theatrics. If Agrippina would not vanish like a ghost, then she must be murdered like a rival. The next attempt would not be poetic. It would be Roman. Agrippina knew. She knew it the way animals know storms before they break, the way veterans feel pain in old wounds before a blade is drawn. She had not clawed her way through emperors, lovers, assassins, and exile just to misread the tremor in a boy's voice. She saw it in the sudden affection, in the summons to come, not to Rome, not to the Senate, but to his villa at Baiae. Again Baiae, again the sea. This time, she did not bring attendants. She did not dress in purple. She arrived as his mother, in name only. The villa was a paradise of engineered calm. Fountains murmuring, birds in golden cages, eunuchs silent as marble. the kind of place designed to erase memory. Nero greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, his lips cool, his hand damp. He had grown paler, softer, theatrical in the worst way, like an actor who had forgotten where the stage ended and the real world began. "Let's dine like we used to," he said. She did. They did. Cold oysters, sweet wine, honeyed figs. Servants came and went with mechanical grace. Nero laughed too loudly. Agrippina smiled too softly. She watched his eyes more than his mouth. She did not eat much. She did not drink at all. When the sun set, he stood to embrace her. "Stay the night," he whispered. "You must be tired." Agrippina rose. "I'm never tired," she said, with a smile that cut like a sickle. But she stayed, not because she trusted him, but because this was the final movement in a symphony she herself had begun composing 18 years earlier, when she laid a laurel crown on his infant brow and told the gods that he would rule. Power had always been the instrument. She had only ever played it better than most. She was given chambers with ivory-paneled walls and perfumed sheets. A single oil lamp burned. The window was open to the sea. She removed her jewelry methodically, folded her stola, and sat on the bed like a queen awaiting execution. And then they came. Not soldiers. That would have been too honest. These were freedmen, thugs wrapped in tunics, clutching blades not yet bloodied. Anicetus led them, former tutor, now assassin, carrying out his son's final lesson. He paused in the doorway. Agrippina did not scream. "So, it ends here," she said, more to herself than to him. They moved forward. The first blow caught her in the shoulder. Another slashed her arm. She staggered but remained standing. Blood ran down her wrist like spilled ink. One of them hesitated. Anicetus shouted. She looked at him, at all of them, not as murderers, but as pupils who had failed to learn history. "Strike the womb," she said. "Strike where you came from." And they did. When it was over, there was no procession, no pyre, no coins minted. The body was burned hastily, buried in secret, ash covered with dirt and denial. Rome was told she had died peacefully, as all great women do, in her sleep. But the city knew. Rome always knew. Nero did not attend the burial. He remained in the villa for days, weeping, drinking, composing verses in which the mother was always a shadow, always misunderstood. He told the Senate it had been necessary, that she had plotted, that it was self-defense. Some nodded. Most bowed. All understood the cost of questioning an emperor who murdered his own mother and still slept at night. But he did not sleep. Not truly. Her ghost remained. In every mirror, in every curtained shadow, in every wine cup he feared to drink from. He tried exorcisms. He banned the word Agrippina from a court. He filled her villas with new concubines, new singers, new laughter. None of it worked. Because you do not kill Agrippina. You release her. She had become myth, legend, a whisper that curdled milk and cracked statues. The woman who birthed emperors and unmade them. The empress mother who stepped through fire, poison, exile, and betrayal, and only finally fell when she chose to fall, on her own terms, with her eyes wide open. Rome would forget her in law, in inscription, in decree. But history? History remembered. She had no mausoleum, no sacred rites carried her name across generations. No public mourning filled the forum with black-veiled matrons sobbing into their silk. Her ashes were scattered like an afterthought, and her likeness chipped away from marble as if it had never smiled beside an emperor. Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, wife of Claudius, mother of Nero, erased as if a woman could be unmade by decree. But names are stubborn things, and so are legacies. What she built could not be buried. It pulsed through the veins of Rome, even as statues cracked and busts were melted into coins. For Nero, her death was not the end of her influence. It was only the moment it metastasized. No longer confined to a chamber, a whisper, a cold glance across the imperial table, Agrippina became something else entirely. A question that haunted the empire itself. What happens when a mother loves her son more than the gods love Rome? What price do you pay for shaping a ruler in your own image? Nero paid in blood, breath, and sanity. At first, he felt free, drunk on victory, surrounded by sycophants who cheered louder now that the silencer was gone. He danced, sang, took lovers by the dozen, and declared himself reborn. But every triumph now rang hollow, as if history refused to clap. He expanded the palace. He set fire to the city and blamed the Christians. He performed his poetry while senators faked ecstasy and bled from their ears. Rome, once pliant, began to groan. He had removed the woman who made him, but in doing so, he lost the only compass that ever understood the terrain. Agrippina had not ruled with mercy. She ruled with memory. She remembered the purges, the bodies, the cold terror of Caligula's court, the corpse of her mother, starved in exile. She learned early that Rome did not reward virtue. It devoured it, dressed in white. That was why she armored Nero with ruthlessness, laced his cradle with ambition. Not because she hated him, but because she loved him in the only way Rome allowed. And perhaps that is what history could not forgive. That a woman, born of war, molded by loss, could play Caesar's game with sharper daggers and better odds, and for a moment win. For years, Rome bent to her will not by law, but by presence. She did not scream, she rearranged. She did not plead, she promised. She spoke in inheritance, in lineage, in the unspoken terror of what she might do if denied. She ruled in silence, and the world obeyed. And in her death, something cracked, not in marble, but in myth. Rome had always worshipped mothers, in statues and slogans. The vestal purity of Livia, the quiet loyalty of Octavia, the distant mourning of Julia. But Agrippina was not made for marble. She did not weep prettily or stand in the shadows behind a god. She stepped forward. She orchestrated. She crowned and uncrowned. And for that, the city tried to forget her. But every time Nero trembled in his sleep, she returned. Every time a senator saw a woman speak too clearly, he saw her ghost. She lived in the fear of precedent, in the muttered warnings passed between emperors. She became a cautionary tale told in corridors. Beware the woman who teaches power. And still, there was Nero, sweating under laurel, aging before his years, crumbling beneath the weight of a throne built on blood. When at last he fell, pursued not by armies, but by memory, it was not the faces of lovers or poets or slaves that haunted him. It was hers, the eyes that saw through him, even in death, the hand that once guided his to ink and dagger alike, the voice that told him, "You will rule, and you will ruin." He died alone, naming no gods, no sons, only regret, and Rome moved on. New emperors came, bearing fresh names and old sins. The past was rewritten, restructured, reburied. But in quiet moments, in candlelit corners of dusty libraries, in the footnotes of forbidden texts, her story flickered back into being. Not as martyr, not as villain, as a force. Agrippina, empress, mother, architect of empire and ruin. Not immortal in flesh, but unerasable in consequence. She had no tomb, but Rome would never be free of her shadow. History is not just the story of men. It is the story of tails, hooves, beaks, horns, fur, and ears, flattened not by wind, but by fear or fury. We like to say that war is a human affair, that it is our battles, our victories, our tragedies. But if animals could write memoirs, they would tell a very different tale. One where the soldier is not just the man holding the spear, but the creature carrying him into the fray. Or in many cases, the one being carried. Before gunpowder crowned man as the sole master of destruction, he was just the conductor. His orchestra walked on four legs. No conqueror ever reached a distant capital without hooves pounding the dirt. No messenger ever slipped through enemy lines without wings. No warship was ever safe from aquatic saboteurs unless dolphins were trained to patrol beneath the waves. If war is theater, then animals were the stage, the props, the extras, and sometimes the stars of the show. Why do we bring animals to war in the first place? The answer is brutally simple. Because humans are fragile bags of ambition. Horses are faster. Elephants are more terrifying. Pigeons don't get lost. And dogs don't ask questions. They just go where you point. March an army across centuries, and you'll quickly realize that brain power only goes so far. Sometimes what you need is thick skin for legs and a stomach that can handle battlefield rations. But this isn't just about utility. Every war animal carries a myth. The war elephant is Hannibal. The war horse is a knight without a sword. The pigeon is a promise delivered. The lion is empire. The wolf is blood unbound. The camel is survival in places no man was meant to live. Even when they do nothing, they symbolize everything. They're the masks we wear to look stronger, faster, braver. Of course, not all animals agreed to this arrangement. Some bolted at the sound of trumpets. Others went mad from the smell of death. Some returned home with letters. Others returned with half a letter and part of an ear. But somehow, we trusted them more than we trusted each other. Because, strangely enough, an animal on the battlefield is often more reliable than a general with delusions of grandeur. Then came the age of powder and steel. The horse was replaced by the tank, the pigeon by the radio, the dog by the drone. Animals faded from the front lines, but they didn't vanish. They lived on, in statues, in crests, in legends. No longer tools of war, they became emblems, not just sidekicks, but icons, myths, and sometimes reminders that man has never fought alone. This is a story about those animals, not as victims, not as weapons, but as participants, as beings who hauled our burdens, saved our lives, tore out throats, carried messages, toppled towers, ran, fell, and rose again. Without medals, without complaints, without graves with their names, but with every right to be remembered as warriors. Before gunpowder, before ironclads and engines and drones, war had a heartbeat. It thundered beneath the hooves of a war horse. Not just any horse, but a beast bred to charge into spear points, to drag chariots across scorched plains, to rear beneath the roar of arrows and stand, unblinking, while empires fell around it. The war horse was not a pet. It was a weapon, a monument in motion, a living engine of conquest, and no civilization worth its bronze went to war without one. In the beginning, they pulled. They hauled the chariots of Sumerians, Hittites, Egyptians. Lithe, nervy creatures lashed to wooden frames that bounced like dice over the bones of battlefields. The driver stood exposed, braced between death and divinity, while the archer beside him loosed hell at full gallop. To command a chariot was to conduct a ballet of speed and precision. And underneath it all, the horse, taut, sweating lungs of flame. They were the first war machines, muscle and madness on wheels. But the chariot was a rich man's weapon. It took a team, a crew, a flat plane, and years of breeding. It was theater, deadly but delicate. Eventually, a simpler idea took hold. Don't ride behind the horse. Ride on it. It seems obvious now, but riding a horse in a battle was revolutionary. You needed stirrups. You needed training. You needed courage, and not just from the rider. Horses are prey animals. Their instinct is to run away from chaos, not into it. You had to rewire their very nature. You had to teach them that the sound of drums meant forward, that blood on their flanks was not a wound but a command, that fire and screams and the smell of ruptured organs was not a signal to flee, but a reason to charge. By the time the Persians swept across the steppes and the Greeks turned their cavalry into hammers, the horse had become a kind of biological exosuit. It extended the soldier's reach, his speed, his stature. You didn't just ride a horse. You became a new creature entirely. Taller than other men. Faster. Deadlier. That transformation terrified those who saw it. Entire tactics were built not around killing horsemen, but simply surviving long enough to escape one. Then came the age of armored horses. As metallurgy improved, so did the ambitions of generals. The horse was no longer just muscle. It was steel. Caparisons, chamfrons, flanchards, names for pieces of armor that turned horses into mobile fortresses. In medieval Europe, a fully armored destrier looked less like a horse and more like a four-legged knight. The charge of heavy cavalry became the medieval equivalent of a cruise missile, unstoppable, expensive, and devastating on impact. But every leap forward in war meets its counterweight. The longbow, the pike square, the disciplined infantry line. The war horse, for all its power, was still flesh and bone. It could be brought down, and when it fell, it often took its rider with it. To fall from a galloping war horse in full armor was to become a turtle on its back in a sea of spears. Glorious, yes, but also vulnerable. Still, no military symbol lasted as long. Alexander wept on Bucephalus's grave. Genghis Khan declared his horse more loyal than his sons. Napoleon knew his cavalry charges were madness, and still unleashed them, because the sight of 5,000 horsemen cresting a hill was sometimes enough to win a battle without firing a shot. Even today, echoes remain. Ceremonial guards still mount black geldings. Statues of generals still raise hooves in solemn salute. Somewhere in our blood, we remember what it meant to ride. Not for leisure, but for empire. The war horse is gone from the battlefield, but it remains in every language of valor, in every painting of glory, in every dream of thunder on the horizon. It was the original war engine, and like all engines, it burned out. But while it lasted, it changed the world. If horses were the cavalry of war, elephants were its tanks. No, not tanks. They were fortresses with legs, nightmares with tusks, the embodiment of brute force and raw intimidation rolled into one majestic, utterly uncontrollable beast. When elephants marched into battle, the ground didn't shake. They made it kneel. The idea was simple. Take the largest land animal on Earth, teach it to trample human beings on command, and watch your enemies collapse in terror before a single spear is thrown. It wasn't about precision. It wasn't even about efficiency. It was about awe. The elephant was war turned theatrical, and in the ancient world, terror was half the battle. India was the birthplace of this madness. The Maurya Empire fielded entire divisions of war elephants, armored and tusked, stomping through jungles and over rivers like walking monuments to Shiva himself. These weren't circus animals. These were trained killers, their heads wrapped in iron, their trunks trained to fling men like javelins. Riders called mahouts, set behind their ears, whispering commands with steel hooks and death wishes. And when the beasts charged, they didn't just attack, they erased. Alexander the Great met them at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, and for the first time in his life, he hesitated. His Macedonian phalanx, built to withstand cavalry, was suddenly facing 10-ton battering rams with tusks, tower-mounted archers, and zero fear. They were hard to kill, harder to stop. They plowed through men like wheat. Horses panicked. Formations broke. And yet, somehow, Alexander won. But he never forgot the lesson. Elephants weren't just soldiers. They were war gods. So, like any good conqueror, he stole the idea. The Seleucids picked it up next. The Ptolemies followed suit. Soon, the elephant was the prestige weapon of choice across the Hellenistic world. To own elephants was to declare yourself a true king. To use them effectively, though, that was another matter. The Carthaginians tried. Oh, how they tried. Hannibal's legendary crossing of the Alps is usually remembered for one thing: the elephants. Through snow, ice, and mountain death traps, he dragged his North African elephants from Spain to the very gates of Rome. It was less strategy than sheer lunacy, and most of the beasts died en route. But the few that survived were enough to strike fear into Roman hearts. Imagine it. You're a poor conscript from the hills of Lazio. You've barely held a spear before, and suddenly a creature the size of your house is galloping toward you wearing armor and screaming through its trunk. The Romans, of course, adapted. They always did. They developed anti-elephant tactics, javelins to the eyes, fire traps, caltrops to shred their feet. They learned that elephants, for all their glory, were not precise instruments. They could panic. They could turn. And when an elephant panics, it does not retreat. It rampages. Through friend or foe, it does not care. And still, commanders kept using them. Pyrrhus did. So did Antiochus. Even Julius Caesar once considered importing elephants from Africa, though he settled on siege engines instead. In the East, however, they never went out of style. The Khmer, the Burmese, the Moguls, they treated elephants not just as weapons, but as divine avatars. Elephants led parades, broke city gates, crushed rebellions. They were war and ritual in equal measure. By the medieval period, the West had mostly given up on them. They were too hard to feed, too hard to transport, and frankly, too unpredictable. But the idea of the war elephant lingered like incense in a ruined temple. Even when obsolete, they symbolized the grandeur of a bygone age, when kings fought like gods and armies moved to the rhythm of thunder. And perhaps that's what war elephants were really about: symbolism. No other creature could turn a battle into a legend. No other animal could so fully embody the terrifying majesty of power. You didn't deploy an elephant because it made sense. You did it because it made history. And when it worked, it wasn't just victory. It was spectacle. Before drones, before chemical weapons, before even the humble bow and arrow, there were dogs. Not the kind that beg for scraps or chase their tails in marble courtyards, but creatures bred and broken for a single purpose: war. Dogs that did not bark, they charged. Dogs that wore spiked collars and leather armor. Dogs that lunged at throats on command and left a trail of red in the mud behind them. War dogs are as old as war itself. The ancient Assyrians bred massive mastiff-like beasts to run alongside their chariots, slavering engines of muscle trained to pull down men like deer. Egyptian tombs showed dogs leaping into battle ahead of soldiers. And in Greece, they patrolled city walls at night, silent sentinels with sharper senses than any guard. But it was the Romans who turned them into military assets, not mascots, not companions, but weapons. They called them canes pugnaces, fighting dogs. Heavy, brutal, bred for jaw strength and bloodlust. Some wore mail, others carried pots of burning pitch strapped to their backs. When unleashed in packs, they didn't just scatter enemies. They broke formations, turned order into chaos, and gave the legion a gap to pour through. And when they didn't kill, they maimed, bitten soldiers scream, and screaming soldiers demoralize armies. Julius Caesar reportedly used them in Gaul. So did the Britons, whose own war dogs, likely ancestors of today's bulldogs, were said to be so ferocious they unnerved even Roman veterans. In one recorded case, a dog continued to fight after its master had fallen, guarding the corpse for hours, fending off scavengers and soldiers alike. Loyalty, it seemed, could be weaponized too, but dogs were never just soldiers. They were scouts, sniffing out ambushes before a single arrow flew. They were messengers, darting across battlefields too dangerous for human runners. In sieges, they carried light supplies, slipped through cracks, retrieved the wounded. In deserts, they found water. In forests, they found fear. And always they obeyed. Of course, they weren't perfect. Dogs could panic. They could turn. Fire terrified them. Loud noises disoriented them. And unlike humans, they didn't understand strategy, only targets. There are tales of war dogs who went rogue in the heat of battle, attacking anything that moved, clawing their way through friend and foe alike until someone finally put a sword in their ribs. But the same could be said of any mercenary. At least dogs didn't demand pay. The Middle Ages saw a strange mix of reverence and horror toward war dogs. Knights trained giant hounds to guard their camps at night. Castles kept packs to hunt down intruders. Even pirates were said to bring dogs on raids, not for companionship, but for carnage. The Spanish, during their conquests in the Americas, unleashed armored mastiffs upon indigenous fighters. The results were not battles, but massacres. For the conquistadors, a dog was worth 5 men and required no gunpowder. In modernity, war dogs changed shape but never vanished. World War I saw them carry messages through trenches, deliver medical kits, and sniff out gas before it killed the whole platoon. In World War II, they patrolled bases, guarded prisoners, and leapt from planes in parachutes with their handlers. Vietnam turned them into scouts. Afghanistan and Iraq made them bomb detectors. Today, they wear Kevlar vests, have their own ranks, and in some units, outrank the men they serve beside. And yet, there's something timeless in the way they fight. A dog doesn't understand empire. It doesn't care about flag or border or ideology. It sees a master and it obeys. It sees a threat and it attacks. That simplicity, horrifying and noble in equal measure, is what makes them endure in warfare, even as machines evolve around them. The war dog is not a relic. It is not extinct. It has merely changed collars. And in every battlefield where fear hangs thick as smoke, you can still find them. Eyes locked forward, breath hot, jaws ready. History has many warriors. Few of them had 4 legs and a heartbeat like a drum. Before engines roared, before tanks rolled, before steel ships split the sea, empires were carried on the backs of horses. Not just ridden, they were forged, fed, and defended with hooves. To walk was to be a peasant. To ride was to be a warrior. To charge on horseback, that was to rule. The war horse was not your everyday farm nag or gentle cart puller. It was a beast bred for battle, trained to kill without even trying. Its hooves could shatter ribs, its bulk could crush skulls, and its momentum, when paired with a lance or sword, was the ancient world's equivalent of a missile. A charging knight on a destrier wasn't a man and an animal. It was a single weapon with armor, muscle, and intent. In the ancient world, horses changed the rules of engagement. The Scythians, nomads of the steppe, lived on horseback. They shot arrows while riding at full gallop, leaning to one side to shield their bodies while loosing deadly volleys within human precision. To fight them was to fight ghosts, here one moment, gone the next, hooves kicking dust into the mouths of slower, grounded foes. The Persians adopted cavalry into imperial doctrine with chilling efficiency. Their cataphracts, heavy cavalry draped in iron scale, were less riders than armored battering rams. When they charged, the earth trembled, and enemy lines broke before blade ever touched bone. And Alexander the Great? His horse Bucephalus was as famous as any general in his army. They didn't just ride together, they conquered together. India, Egypt, Persia, all carved by the arc of a cavalry saber. But no one elevated the war horse quite like the Romans. They built entire units, equites, auxilia cavalry, to flank and harass enemies, to deliver messages, to scout, to chase. When the legions failed, the cavalry survived. And when Rome fell, it was horsemen who rose from the ashes. The medieval knight was a monument to the war horse. These weren't lean, fragile creatures. They were massive, bred for power and weight, able to carry a fully armored man and still gallop into the fray. The lance became an extension of the horse's speed, the shield, an extension of its chest. Battles like Agincourt and Poitiers didn't just test the mettle of men. They tested whether mud, arrows, and fatigue could stop a wall of flesh and steel moving at 30 miles per hour. Of course, horses weren't just brute force. The Mongols turned the war horse into a stealth weapon. Small, hardy, fast, they could ride for days without fodder, live off grass, drink from puddles. Mongol warriors rode with extra mounts, switching mid-battle, never tiring. They circled enemies like wolves, shooting backwards over their shoulders while retreating. Feigned flight as trap. It wasn't just a new tactic, it was a new philosophy of war. And the horse made it possible. Even in gunpowder's dawn, horses clung to relevance. Cavalry charges decided the fate of Napoleonic Europe. Hussars, cuirassiers, dragoons, they weren't obsolete yet. They could outpace infantry, strike deep behind lines, panic an army with thunder and flashing blades. At Waterloo, the hoofbeats of thousands of mounted troops echoed louder than cannon. The charge of the Light Brigade, brave, doomed, iconic, wasn't about victory. It was about the image of men still believing that speed and courage could outrun bullets. By the First World War, the truth arrived, they couldn't. Horses were slaughtered by machine guns, torn apart by barbed wire, shelled in trenches not made for hoofs. Yet even then, they served, hauling supplies, dragging artillery, dying by the millions. The war memorials remember the soldiers. Few remember the horses, but their legacy is carved deep. Every empire worth its salt had a stable. Every conqueror had a mount whose name lingered just as long as their masters. Bucephalus, Marengo, Copenhagen. The American West was not one on foot. The Plains Wars, the Civil War, Napoleon's campaigns, Genghis Khan's empire, all rode on the same rhythm. For hooves, one heart, endless war. Today, they're gone from the battlefield, replaced by steel and circuits. But you can still hear them in old cavalry songs, in the thunder of distant hooves across museum floors, in the smell of leather and dust. The war horse didn't vanish. It simply trotted into myth. Where once was breath, now there's silence. But history remembers. They weren't bred. They were summoned, taken from jungles, mountains, and swamps. Not tamed, but coerced into empire. Elephants did not belong on battlefields, and that's precisely why they terrified those who saw them. No animal had more raw mass, more presence, more psychological gravity than an elephant armored for war. And when they marched, the earth itself seemed to move in protest. The earliest empires to field elephants didn't do it subtly. The Indian subcontinent had already mastered elephant warfare by the time Alexander crossed the Indus. The Maurya Empire didn't just use them, They built their armies around them. War elephants were platforms for archers, mobile towers, and wrecking balls with tusks tipped in iron. A single charge could scatter infantry like leaves in wind. Horses panicked. Men froze. The elephant didn't fight. Its presence won. When Alexander the Great encountered war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE, he won the day, but barely. His soldiers had never faced beasts that large, that relentless. The elephants smashed phalanxes, trampled shields, and threw men like ragdolls. Alexander, always the pragmatist, didn't swear vengeance. He swore recruitment. He added elephants to his own forces immediately, because even a myth chaser like him knew size mattered. The tradition spread westward. The Seleucids fielded them, the Ptolemies paraded them, and then Hannibal. Ah yes, Hannibal Barca. If elephants were Rome's nightmare, Hannibal was their sleep paralysis demon. In 218 BCE, he famously dragged his elephants, yes, elephants, over the Alps through snow and stone into the Italian heartland. He lost most of them, of course. Elephants are not fond of freezing cliffs, but the few that survived terrified the Romans into paralysis. They weren't used for victory. They were used for theater, a message carved in ivory and survival. I will not fight you where you expect me. Carthaginian elephants thundered through battles like Zama, where Scipio Africanus learned how to break them. Open corridors, let them pass, and attack the riders. But even in failure, the elephants forced adaptation. They reshaped tactics by their very presence. They were too big to ignore, too powerful to dismiss. Every general from Rome to Parthia had to decide, what do we do when a jungle comes charging? But elephants were never perfect weapons. They were chaos incarnate, panicked easily. If wounded, they turned and trampled their own. Fire and noise broke their minds. Commanders rode them not because they were stable, but because nothing else let you tower that high over a battlefield. They were prestige weapons, symbols of majesty and menace, meant to crush morale more than men. In the East, elephants continued to dominate. Khmer armies in Southeast Asia, Burmese kings, Thai warlords, all treated elephants like moving thrones. The Ayutthaya kingdom bred elephants for generations, painting them, blessing them, and sending them into war like gods wrapped in hide. In many cultures, killing an elephant wasn't just military victory, it was sacrilege. And yet, technology crept in. Gunpowder did what swords and arrows couldn't. Cannons pierced even the thickest hides. Muskets shattered the illusion of invincibility. At the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company faced Mughal forces that still used elephants. The result? Devastation for the elephants. Explosions, fire, chaos. Once proud, once feared, they died in confusion, blind to the world that had outpaced them. By the 19th century, the war elephant was no more, replaced not by machines, but by the sheer pace of modern warfare. Too slow, too fragile, too valuable to lose. The beast that once shattered empires now carried logs, performed tricks for colonists, or marched in parades with painted trunks and shame in its eyes. But if elephants faded from war, they never faded from memory. They linger in symbols, badges, thrones, statues. Indian temples still carve them as guardians. Southeast Asian kings still claim them as divine. And even Rome, once terrified, kept elephant mosaics on its walls long after the animals vanished from its armies. Because elephants were never just animals. They were myths with heartbeat, towers with emotion, and for one brutal, magnificent chapter in military history, they were war itself. They don't march. They don't stomp. They don't drag siege towers or carry kings. but they see everything. Birds were not war machines. They were war's messengers, its omens, its eyes in the sky. And for as long as men have killed each other for flags, borders, and pride, birds have been circling above them, watching, warning, weaponized. Let's start with the humble pigeon. Ridiculous? Not quite. This fluttering, wide-eyed street nuisance once held the fate of cities in its claws. Homing pigeons, trained with an almost obsessive ritualism, were the world's first reliable long-range communication system. No drums, no smoke, just feathers and instinct. In the ancient Near East, in Persia, in the Roman Empire, pigeons carried military orders across miles and hours. In siege warfare, when cities were cut off and every gate barred, a pigeon could slip through enemy lines unseen. A single bird could mean the difference between reinforcements and massacre. Julius Caesar used them. So did Genghis Khan. In fact, Genghis established entire pigeon relay systems, an airborne pony express of empire. They weren't pets. They were assets. And if a pigeon landed in the wrong hands or the wrong beak, well, let's just say hawks were employed for more than symbolism. But not all birds were postmen. Some were prophets. In the ancient world, generals didn't always trust their own instincts. They asked the skies. Roman augurs watched the flight of birds to read divine will. A hawk flying left? Bad omen. A flock rising from the east? The gods approve. Entire campaigns were launched or abandoned because of a crow's wing beat. It wasn't strategy. It was superstition dressed in feathers and fear. But in an era where storms meant curses and eclipses meant doom, birds were not just animals. They were oracles. And then came the hunters. Falconry wasn't born for war, but war adopted it quickly. Mongol warriors rode with falcons perched on their saddles, releasing them to track or harass prey. Birds weren't going to tear through armored knights, but they could spot movement, spook camps, or chase off scouts. More than that, falconry was status. A warlord with a trained hawk didn't just look impressive, he looked omniscient. But birds in war didn't stop at hunting. By the Middle Ages, they became targets themselves. Enemy pigeons were intercepted, their messages decoded. Entire anti-pigeon units existed during World War I and II. Yes, soldiers were ordered to shoot down birds. There are records of snipers stationed specifically to eliminate feathered couriers. Pigeon espionage was real and dangerous. And while we're on world wars, let's talk about one of history's most decorated veterans, Cher Ami. A pigeon used by the U.S. Army Signal Corps in 1918. Shot through the chest, blinded in one eye, and with one leg barely attached, she still delivered a message that saved over 200 men from friendly fire. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre, stuffed, and mounted in the Smithsonian. That's not an anecdote. That's war. Of course, not every military bird was so noble. In Cold War experiments, the CIA tried to train pigeons to carry cameras. The results were mixed. One particularly blurry pigeon-borne photo of a Soviet submarine base is still classified, possibly because no one can tell if it's a boat or a shadow. The Soviets tried to one-up them by training seagulls to detect underwater mines. Dolphins were more reliable, but the ambition remained: turn nature into weaponry. Even stranger were the weaponized bird ideas that never quite flew. The U.S. once proposed Project X-ray, involving bats strapped with incendiary devices. The idea was to release them over Japanese cities, where they'd roost in wooden buildings and explode. It didn't work. The bats ignited the test facility instead. But the fact that someone funded it at all says everything about war's desperate creativity. And then there's the symbolic layer. Birds have always been empires' mascots. The eagle of Rome, the eagle of Napoleon, the eagle of the Third Reich, the bald eagle of the United States. each a predator, each a message. You can't reason with a raptor. It either soars or strikes. The bird is never neutral. It watches, it waits, and when it moves, someone bleeds. Today, birds have been replaced by drones, satellites, and surveillance systems that never sleep. But there's a strange comfort in knowing that the first Air Force was feathered. That long before we launched missiles into the stratosphere, we launched doves with tiny notes. And somewhere, even now, a pigeon might be watching, waiting, listening, remembering the time when birds were not just part of the sky, but part of the war. Not every army wore boots. Some slithered, some stung, some chirped in the dark before devouring you alive. While history loves to glorify steel and strategy, there's a much stranger chapter lurking just beneath the polished armor. The long, terrifying saga of animals used not just in battle, but as battle. Let's start with snakes. Yes, snakes. In ancient times, some navies weaponized them quite literally. The Greeks, the Romans, even certain Indian kingdoms were known to load jars with venomous serpents, vipers, cobras, anything that hissed and bit, and catapult them onto enemy ships or fortifications. Picture it. Your legion is setting up siege lines, and suddenly it's not arrows falling from the sky. It's baskets of angry, confused, venom-packed nightmares. There's no defense formation for that. You drop your shield, you run, or you get bit. It wasn't just painful. It was psychological warfare at its most primal. You could train against swords. You can't train against panic. Hannibal, that master of unconventional war, was reportedly fond of this method. During a naval skirmish, he had barrels of snakes lobbed onto enemy decks. The soldiers on the receiving end didn't drown. They jumped overboard by choice. But snakes were just the beginning. The next horror? Insects. Swarms. The buzzing, crawling, unstoppable kind. In medieval and early modern warfare, defenders of castles and fortresses sometimes unleashed bees or wasps upon besiegers. Hives were hurled, catapulted, or strategically opened when enemies attempted to scale walls. Climbing a siege ladder is hard enough. Climbing it while hornets sting your eyes and bees crawl into your armor, that's how you fall. African tribes defending against colonial invaders took it a step further, weaponizing not only bee colonies, but also entire termite mounds, hurling them into supply lines. Even in Vietnam, guerrilla fighters rigged booby traps with ant nests, disturbing them as American troops passed, causing chaos without a single bullet fired. And then came the fire beasts. The ancient Chinese and Byzantines both experimented with flaming animals, oxen, pigs, even birds, drenched in pitch and tar, set alight, and sent charging toward enemy lines or siege engines. This wasn't cruelty for spectacle. It was tactical fire. A panicked, burning pig could disrupt cavalry formations. A flaming rooster flying into a wooden watchtower? That's an inferno with wings. The technique was messy, unpredictable, and often dangerous to its own side. But in war, chaos has value. Let's talk elephants. We think of them as giant tanks, but the truth is stranger. Elephants were terrifying psychological weapons. Their size, their trumpet screams, their crushing power. Few infantry lines held fast when they saw a wall of gray thunderstorm galloping toward them. But even elephants had their twisted variations. The Seleucid Empire is said to have experimented with armor-clad elephants covered in metal spikes, their tusks fitted with blades, their trunks used to swing heavy chains. It was not enough for the elephant to crush. It had to mutilate. On the other end of the size spectrum, rats. The British during World War II conceived a plan involving dead rats stuffed with explosives. The idea was simple: leave them near boilers in Nazi facilities. When German soldiers, assuming a vermin problem, tossed them into fires, the rats would explode, sabotaging equipment and morale. The plan was discovered early, but the psychological effect remained. Nazi officers spent resources inspecting every dead rat. War makes even the absurd dangerous. And it wouldn't be complete without mentioning dogs. Dogs were sentinel scouts, mine detectors, and sometimes bombs. The Soviet Union trained dogs to carry explosives to enemy tanks during World War II. The plan? The dog, taught to run toward food placed under tanks during training, would dive under enemy vehicles with a bomb strapped to its back. But there was a flaw. They trained the dogs using Soviet tanks. In real battle, the dogs often ran under their own lines' vehicles, causing chaos and tragedy. The program was eventually halted, but it remains one of the most haunting examples of desperate innovation. Even cats weren't safe. During the siege of a city, attackers would sometimes strap cats to shields or launch them toward enemy walls, knowing the defenders, often Egyptian or Persian, worshipped or revered the animals. Kill the enemy, fine. Hordakat, blasphemy. Taboos became shields. What's the pattern here? Nature was never neutral. In the theater of war, animals became extensions of human desperation, creativity, and cruelty. They were tools, symbols, sacrifices. Whether hissing, buzzing, stampeding, or simply twitching, they turned the battlefield into something more than lines and weapons. They made it wild again, unpredictable, horrific, and yet, through it all, it was never really about the animals. It was about fear. The soldier who stands firm against a spear might crumble before a wasp nest. The commander who laughs at arrows might panic at the sound of wings. Because in war, it's not just about killing. It's about unmaking the will to fight. So next time you look at a dove, a snake, or a cloud of bees, remember, they too have marched to war. Not by choice, but by command. Before there were tanks, before steel tracks thundered across muddy battlefields, there were elephants, living siege engines, intelligent mountains of muscle that could carry towers on their backs and armies in their wake. When a war elephant charged, it wasn't just a beast that approached. It was a quake in the earth, a storm with tusks. And for centuries, these colossal creatures were the terror of the battlefield. Let's go back to India, where it all began. Indian kingdoms were among the first to domesticate elephants not for work, but for war. These were not passive pack animals. They were trained to trample, gore, and crush, guided by skilled mahouts who directed them with knees, feet, and sharpened hooks. Some elephants wore armor, steel masks with eye slits, plates covering their ears and flanks. Their tusks were sometimes fitted with blades, turning each head toss into a circular saw of ivory and iron. When Alexander the Great invaded India in the 4th century BCE, he met his match at the Battle of the Hydaspes. The army of King Porus stood its ground with war elephants, dozens of them, lined up like a living wall. Alexander, used to phalanxes and cavalry, suddenly had to outmaneuver 10-foot-tall wrecking balls that could break ranks and scatter formations. The elephants crushed horses, overturned chariots, and sent entire battalions into retreat. Alexander won the battle, but not before tasting what a true elephant charge felt like. He never forgot it. Neither did Rome. From India, the idea lumbered westward. The Seleucid Empire, inheriting parts of Alexander's domain, adopted elephants with enthusiasm. The Ptolemies of Egypt countered with their own. Carthage, always eager to irritate Rome, trained elephants too. The others came from North Africa and were often smaller, more temperamental. Still, they were effective enough when led by the one man every Roman child was taught to fear, Hannibal. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps is one of the most legendary military maneuvers in history. And yes, it included elephants. Picture it. Winter snow, narrow goat paths, freezing winds, and a line of elephants trudging across the mountains like ghosts. Not all survived the journey, but those who did descended into Italy like demons. At the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal unleashed them against Roman cavalry. The result? Pandemonium. Horses refused to approach. Riders were thrown. The Romans, so proud of their discipline, crumbled before a trumpeting wall of tusks. But elephants weren't just for terror. They were for tactics. In battle, they broke lines. Their sheer mass could crush a shield wall like kindling. Once inside a formation, they turned chaos into collapse. Infantry scattered. Archers fled, and behind them came cavalry and infantry, following the path the elephant had opened with its massive feet and unstoppable momentum. Of course, the Romans being Romans, they adapted. They studied. They learned. By the time of the Battle of Zama, Rome had figured out how to counter elephants. Scipio Africanus had his men part their ranks like a gate, creating corridors for the charging beasts. Trumpets blared, spears jabbed, and the elephants, confused and panicked, ran straight through the gaps, doing more damage to their own side than the enemy. Elephants, once invincible, became a liability, and Rome, ruthless as ever, stopped fearing them. But that didn't kill the war elephant. It just changed how they were used. In the East, elephants never went out of style. In Southeast Asia, from Burma to Thailand to Vietnam, kings rode into battle atop armored elephants, their thrones swaying with each massive step. These elephants were symbols of divine power. When two rival kings met, they often did so on elephants' backs, dueling not just as rulers, but as gods on mobile altars. Entire wars were decided by single elephant duels. Lose your elephant, lose your throne. In China, elephants had their moment too. During the Southern Han Dynasty, war elephants were deployed with shocking results, until the Song Dynasty countered them with crossbows and fire. Once again, the old beast met the new mind. Even into the 16th and 17th centuries, elephants were still marching into battle. The Mughal Empire used them to carry artillery, to storm fortresses, to trample rebellion underfoot. But as gunpowder grew louder, the elephant's role grew smaller. Muskets confused them. Cannons terrified them. No armor could save an elephant from a direct hit, and no amount of training could stop one from panicking when the sky exploded around its ears. And yet, despite their decline, elephants remain one of the most potent images in military history. They were never just animals. They were walking towers, living symbols of strength, courage, and majesty. They reminded the enemy that nature, when harnessed, could be more terrifying than any man-made machine. Today, war elephants are gone, but echoes remain. Modern tanks are named after beasts: panther, tiger, elephant, for a reason. They mimic that primal awe, that unstoppable momentum. The battlefield no longer trembles under feet of flesh, but the memory of thunder still lingers.